warm welcome from me, colleagues. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Helen Martin, one of the directors of the Gateway Alliance, but there's lots of familiar faces and names on the screen, so it's lovely to see you this afternoon. As I say, thank you for joining us. We know how tricky things are at the moment in terms of your workload, what you're doing day to day, and then obviously planning for next week and beyond. A huge amount going on at the moment. So we're really, really, pleased that you've been able to prioritise the time to join us today. The session is being recorded, so if you do miss bits or you want to recap on these things, then it will be available on the Maths Network members area for a time. So please do. I'll send you an email out about how you can access that after the session as well. Hopefully most people are familiar with using Zoom, but just in case you're not, there is a chat function, should be at the bottom of the screen. You can click on that and add comments or questions. We'll be able to monitor those and obviously put those to Craig during the session if they're appropriate to intervene at that point. We will be doing a breakout room. Those are very self-explanatory. We can set those up. You should have a notification that comes up on your screen to accept and go into a breakout room, and hopefully that will just be mirroring like a table discussion. Hopefully you're familiar with that as well. As I say, if you can keep your microphones off during the session, that really helps in terms of minimising any background noise, but please feel free to keep your cameras on. So Craig's got some feedback in terms of engagement. I think that's all from me in terms of a welcome from me. I'm going to pass over to Viv, who's going to welcome Craig and just say a quick hello to everybody as well. So over to you, Viv.
Hi there, my name's Viv Townsend. I'm the maths lead at Gateway. So welcome all to the second half of the conference. Just want to welcome Craig again and to introduce him to you. If you weren't here last time, you missed the very lengthy version of this, but Craig's a really experienced maths teacher, a maths communicator, and maths writer and podcaster, and has numerous websites devoted to mathematics education. Definitely worth sort of stalking him online. There's so much amazing information out there that he's involved with. Last time he was with us, we had such an interesting and very timely session, which was really focused on how we can sort of communicate maths and to get children thinking about maths and thinking about how we learn maths. And I don't know about you, but I took away so much. It was so timely, thinking about how we maybe communicate images, combine images and text and narration and all of that kind of thing. So timely for our online learning. So Craig, I'm really looking forward to this afternoon again. That sort of lovely combination of research and very practical ideas. I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. So over to you. Welcome.
Perfect. Thanks, Viv. Thanks, Helen. And yeah, just to echo what Helen said as well at the start, thank you for making the time to come here this afternoon. I know everyone's knackered. I know you've got mixed emotions about what's happening next week and so on and so forth. So thank you for making the time. I'll do my very best to make this as useful as possible. And out of all the things I talk about, this is one of my favorites because it's really, really practical. And if you buy into any of the ideas we're going to share tonight, you can use them straight away. You can use them online if you want in your lesson tomorrow, or you can use them Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whenever, when the kids are back in the classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen very briefly, just so I can flip over to the PowerPoint. And I've just got to press one more thing, and it's just this. And fingers crossed you can see my full screen there. Fantastic thumbs up from Helen. I should also apologise, by the way. I'm suffering from lockdown hair here. I've mistimed my haircut at the start of this lockdown. It's getting worse and worse by the day. I've attempted to kind of push it down a bit, but it could get kind of puffier as the session goes on. We'll see how we go. So we're talking intelligent practice. This is one of the most controversial things I talk about. People say I talk absolute nonsense on this. They say I talk nonsense on a lot of things, but intelligent practice in particular. This is what I was called the most dangerous and clueless man in maths education about by quite a prominent educationalist. So take everything I say with a pinch of salt, just generally, but in particular this. But I'm really looking forward to sharing these ideas with you because I believe so passionately in these. So just before we crack on, just the usual thing, just to give you a bit of background, all the research for today's session, I was lucky enough to do when writing my first book, where I first came across and thought hard about the concept of variation theory that we'll talk about. My second book is all about this stuff. It's 600, 700 pages dedicated to these ideas. But everything I'm going to share with you tonight is brand new. I'm not going to share a single sequence that's contained in the book. So if you're one of those unfortunate people who's read this big purple book and managed to get through it, it's all fresh stuff today that I'm going to be sharing with you. As ever, my podcast provides sources of inspiration for me. I've spoken a lot about variation theory with, for example, example, Anne Watson, we've spoke a lot, Chris Bolton, people who know far more about this kind of stuff than me. And the big thing, as always with my sessions, the thing that I really try and do is share with you the experiences I've had working with teachers and students all around the world who've taken my simple ideas and made them work for them. Now, that's going to be really important today because we're going to be doing lots of maths. So if you've got a pen and paper ready, you'll certainly need that. But what I'm going to be focusing on is we're going to be doing this as kind of mathematicians, as maths teachers and so on. But how do we make this work for our kids? So that's going to be a really important session where I slotted today, where I share with you examples from all around the world of teachers in primary and secondary who found ways to make this work for them. So the aim of today's session is this. I want to try and find a way, or I've been on a quest to do this for a long, long time, to make the practice we give our students as effective as possible. Because a lot of the practice that I've given my students in the past has been deficient. It's really fallen foul. It's been fine for some kids who needed the exact amount of practice I was giving them. But for some kids, there wasn't enough practice. And for some students, there was too much. They were ready to go on to deeper thinking. So I'm trying to now come up with a way to get students practicing the basics, because I'm a big believer in practice to master and conquer mathematics. But what I'm looking at is trying to make that practice as effective as possible. Now, again, I will just cover a little bit in today's session of some brand new stuff. If you're interested in knowing more, I have the complete intelligent practice course. I bang on for hours on that. I tell you what, you don't take that anytime soon after this session, because you'll be sick of my voice talking about this. But if you miss anything or anything like that, obviously you've got the recording from today, but I go in depth on that course. So feel free to check that out. As Helen said, there'll be lots of mini breaks, chances for you to collaborate. We're going to have one very, very soon, because I want to see where you're at the start of this session. You'll be with the same people throughout the session, so you can just kind of pick up where you left off if the kind of breakout room thing finishes too soon, and so on and so forth. And also the final thing is I'm going to avoid, unless there's a real burning issue, I'm going to save questions till the end if that's okay. I'll try and free up 10-15 minutes. We've got 2-hour sessions, so I'll try and free up 10-15 minutes at the end and bang your questions down, and then hopefully Helen or Viv can curate them, and all the crackers, you can fire them at me at the end, and I'll try my best to answer them. So here's my first question for you. So we're going to go into breakout rooms for this. What I'm interested in is when you have taught a new idea to your students, when you've introduced a new idea, whether it's adding fractions, something with place value, whatever it is, what does that first bit of practice look like? After you've introduced this new idea to your students, what does it look like? Is it a worksheet? Is it an open-ended problem-solving question? What does that first bit of practice look like? And what does the phrase intelligent practice mean to you? Have you heard that being bandied around? Do you have a kind of definition in your head and so on? So those two things, I wonder if you could, after you've said hello to whoever's in your breakout group, can you talk about your first bit of practice that you give your students after a new idea and what you take from the term intelligent practice? So Helen or Viv, can we breakout room it, if that's okay, please, just to discuss those two things.
Okay then, Craig, that's all the rooms closed and everybody's just back with us now.
Perfect. Thanks, Helen. Welcome back, everybody. As I said, you'll be with that same group throughout the session. We'll probably do 4 more of these breakout rooms, so you'll get to know your colleagues very well in there if you don't already. Right. So as I alluded to at the start, people say I talk rubbish about this kind of thing. One thing they say, they say I talk rubbish on numerous areas surrounding this, but one particular area is that this notion of practice. Do students need to practice mathematics, and what does that practice look like? I'm a great believer in the importance of practice, and crucially, practice that removes all kind of context, removes all what might be considered kind of real life things and so on. Initially, to get students to focus on the pure mathematics, and then later on comes this kind of more sophisticated problem solving, this sifting through the surface structure, and so on. I really like this as just a kind of general way of kind of summing up what I think about it. Just have a quick look at this. For me, there's no shortcut to this. Kids have got to put in the hard yards, but the difficulty is, as I alluded to at the start, some students need more practice than others. Some students need less practice, and so on. And it's hard, if not impossible, to get the balance right. So what I'm going to be presenting to you this afternoon is my attempt to do this. And we're going to start by just doing some maths without me giving you any prompting or anything like that. I just want you to work through this sequence of 10 questions. So you need a pen and paper, or pencil and paper with you, if that's okay. And I just want you to do this on your own first. And then after a few minutes, it doesn't matter if you don't finish all 10 or anything like that. After a few minutes, I'm going to put some prompts on the screen for you to think about. And then we're going to dive back into breakout rooms and discuss those prompts. But before we go anywhere near that, I just want you to do a bit of maths, if that's okay. So I've selected a lovely bit of fractions to kick things off here. So we're going to go for this. Now, the reason I'm focusing on fractions of an amount is because it's a topic that students of all ages struggle with. And you might not think that they do, because it seems a relatively straightforward thing. Of all the things in fractions for them to go wrong on, surely not fractions of an amount. Surely it's going to be when they're adding fractions or multiplying or the concept of a fraction. But if I just show you this question from my Diagnostic Questions website, and some of you may be aware of my website, this particular question has been answered, I think, 70,000 times by students. The youngest student who's answered this one is age 6. The oldest student is 16. If I just put all the results together, this question, which is, again, there's no context, there's no twist or anything, it's only answered correctly 64% of the time, which I find fairly surprising. And again, those of you who know my Diagnostic Questions website will know that every time students vote A, B, C, or D, they're also prompted to give an explanation. And if I just share with you a common explanation from a student who voted for A, which is the most popular choice of wrong answer, you see things like this. Just have a read of that. So you get here a student who is diving into some algorithm, diving into some rule, but they've kind of forgotten the other bit of the rule, the kind of second half of it. Perhaps they've been told you always divide by the denominator, and then that bit about doing something with that numerator, that's fallen off somewhere kind of in their memory. They don't seem to have this kind of deep conceptual understanding to look and think, well, 6 can't be right, and so on. So it surprises me that straightforward questions like that are badly answered. But when you have something like this causes problems as well. Just have a look at this one. So when you see something like this, perhaps again, this will be less of a surprise that students struggle with this, because you kind of have to do a bit of backwards stuff on this. It's not as straightforward. But again, we're only talking 62% of students who are getting this correct. Perhaps no surprise, the most popular choice of wrong answer is A, 24. Why are students going for 24? Well, again, if I pick out a student explanation, this time they are doing fractions of an amount, but they're doing 2/3 of 36. They're not realizing it's kind of a missing number problem, and so on and so forth. So just to give you a bit of an insight into how my mind works, anytime I see my students struggle with something, or more and more these days, anytime I look on my Diagnostic Questions website and I find a problematic area, a problematic concept, I always think, how can I design a or a sequence of questions or an activity to tackle those problems that the data seems to be throwing up. So this is my attempt to do it. So as I say, I'm going to present these 10 questions with no instructions or anything like that. I just want you to have a go at them. Then we're going to have a chat about them in a few minutes. So I'm going to shut up. You'll be pleased to know. Just have a go at as many of those 10 questions as you can. Just give you another kind of 90 seconds or so. Again, no requirement to finish this. I would recommend, if you're not writing down the answers, just to do so. The more we can replicate what our students would be doing, the more we can kind of figure out what's going to work best. So if you're doing these in your head, just bang them on a bit of paper. That'd be fantastic. So, but just over a minute, then I'm going to give you something to reflect on, if that's okay. Okay, as I say, no problem whatsoever if you haven't quite finished this. What I'd like you to do now is, whatever bit you kind of got up to, I'd like you just to take a moment on your own first, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms, just to think about the following 4 prompts. So first, is there anything about this sequence of 10 questions that you liked? And the answer to that might be no, this is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. So, but is there anything that you liked about this? Secondly, are there any relationships between questions that you think are particularly important? So it may be the link between question 3 and 4, or the link between 4 and 5. Is there anything that feels like something that you'd like to discuss with your students? What I'm also interested in is, where would you go next? If you were writing questions 11 and 12 in this sequence, what would they be? What areas of mathematics would you like to dive into? Where would you take this? Where would it progress? And then finally, is there anything that concerns you? Any questions you have about any decisions I made writing this? Anything that you think is missing? Anything like that? Now, I don't expect you to have answers to all of this, but if we can just spend 2 minutes on our own thinking about these prompts now, perhaps jotting something down, then when you go into your breakout groups, I'd like you just to swap kind of answers and thoughts with each other, if that's all right. So just 2 minutes on our own, just considering these 4 prompts in relation to this sequence. Okay, now just before I ask Helen and Viv to put you in your breakout groups, you won't have access to this screen. Your breakout group, you'll just be able to kind of see each other. So feel free to either take a quick picture of the screen, or if you think you can remember what each of these points were, fantastic, or perhaps jot them down just quickly, just before you you join your breakout groups. And what I'd like you to do in your breakout groups is just to share your experiences doing this sequence, perhaps using these prompts to help you. Was there anything you liked? Is it the same as the other person in your breakout group likes? What relationships would you find the most interesting to discuss with your students? Have you thought what question 11 or 12 would be? And are there any concerns you have with this? And then what we'll do, we'll come back. I'll get a bit of feedback from you, perhaps just throw it out there, see if anybody wants to chip in with anything about these. Then I'll share with you some classroom experiences, both virtually and face-to-face in primary and secondary, that I've had with the sequence. And that'll then take us through to the pedagogy about how to get the most out of this kind of thinking. So if I could ask Helen, perhaps and Viv to fire up the breakout groups, if that's all right, and we'll come back in a few minutes' time.
Yeah, sure. I'll press the button now. If people were in a breakout room and colleagues had any problems with cameras and microphones and that didn't work for you, stay on and we'll be able to put you in a different one anyway this time. I'll open them now. Thanks then. Okay, I think that's all the rooms closed now, Craig, so everybody should be back with us.
That's great. Thanks, Helen. Perfect. Now, a couple of things to say before I kind of carry on chatting here. I'm going to show you a little later on in this session my website, which is completely free, where I host all these sequences. And as of this morning, I think there's 430 of them on the site, of which I reckon around about 200 of them are suitable up to year 6. What we're going to be doing tonight is a mixture of trying sequences out, but then interspersing it with the pedagogy, how to get your students kind of mathematically behaving in a way to get the most out of something like this. So with that in mind, I'm going to take a bit of a risk here and throw it out to the crowd. Now, again, I know it's kind of intimidating speaking anytime, anywhere, but there's something about Zoom that makes it a lot harder. But I wonder if anybody, and again, no pressure whatsoever, has anything, let's start with the positives, anything that they liked about this sequence. If you do, if you could just unmute yourself and yell out and just say who you are, or perhaps Helen and Viv could help me identify who they are with, because I can only see a couple of people on the screen. And let's start with that. Was there anything anybody liked about this sequence?
Yeah, we like that there wasn't a huge variation within the numbers. So, maybe previous years we might have done, I don't know, 1/5 of 30, then jumped onto 1/5 of 90 and just sort of flitted about. Whereas all of these here, there seemed to be a relationship between lots of the numbers that children could build on.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, there's a couple of things in that. I think it's a really smart observation. Thank you. There's 2 things I wanted to pick up on there. One is the kind of more obvious point that what I'm trying to do throughout all of the sequences we see tonight and the 500, 600 on the website is to tap into a very simple principle of variation theory, which is that the more you hold constant and the less you change, the more students attribute any change in the answer to what's changed in the question. So to take Nicole's point, if it was 1/5 of 30 followed by 1/4 of 80 or whatever, then sure, the answer changes, but the question's changed as well. So how do you pinpoint what is it about the question that's had that impact on the answer? So that's the kind of fairly obvious point, but I think Nicole's hit on something else as well. What I've purposely tried to do here is avoid trying to do too much. The focus of these 10 questions is not to develop fluency in times tables division, because that's what I've done in the past with exercises on fractions of an amount have become essentially, once you learn to divide by the bottom and times by the top, the exercise simply becomes, do you know your times tables? Do you know what 30 divided by 5 is? And then can you multiply it by 4? So the shift of the exercise, the shift of the practice moves away. So by holding numbers constant, by keeping a good run of 15s, for 6 questions. I mean, there's only really 3 or 4 different numbers involved here. That means the shift moves back. It shifts back towards thinking about fractions and amount. What is the process we're actually doing, as opposed to having all our attention taken up on a kind of a different process, which is the times tables. So I won't be going anywhere near this sequence until I was pretty sure my students' times tables were relatively secure in, because I want as much attention as possible to be focused on the differences between questions, the relationships between them, and so on. Yeah, thanks, Nicole. That was a brilliant point. Thank you. Well, Nicole set the standard there. Does anybody else have anything else that they like? Let's stay positive for the time being. Anything else anybody liked about this?
We talked about how it sort of got progressively harder and how it was just one thing that was changing each time that we were looking at, but the skills got harder as you went on. And also the fact that it's kind of reinforced and thought about things that they already knew and could draw on their knowledge to help them answer the question. So you're doubling and you're halving, and so bringing all that sort of together.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsty. Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, there's again two things in Kirsty's point there that I just wanted to pick up on. A lot of exercises, and I don't know if you find this yourself, whether it's from a textbook or a worksheet or whatever, they have a natural progression of difficulty where question 1 tends to be the easiest, moving through to, in this case, question 10, which is the more difficult. Now, that seems very sensible, and again, it is a really sensible approach. And I tend to do similar things with these sequences where the later questions will tend to be more difficult than the earlier, but that's not always the case. But I'll tell you a problem with that, and that is that often the most interesting mathematics lies towards the end of a sequence. So it's like questions 1 to 5 tend to be fairly dull stuff in most textbooks or most online resources or whatever. And it's only when you get to kind of question 8 or 9 that the interesting stuff starts to happen. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that means the majority of students never experience the interesting stuff in terms of the practice. They're stuck doing the boring stuff. But you don't want to then make question 1 a stinker, because then a load of kids can't even get anywhere with it. So what I try to do with this is make the interesting thing, not the individual questions, but the relationships between the questions. So that means if you answer question 1, you're already then in the kind of mathematical behavior I'm going to talk about, you already have something interesting to think about, because before you answer question 2, I'm going to challenge you to reflect and expect, as we'll talk about in a second. And then once you've answered question 2, I'm going to challenge you to check and explain. So even though you may have a student in your class who only gets through questions 1 to 5, but that doesn't mean they've dipped out in terms of doing the more interesting mathematics, because it's the relationships which are hopefully going to provide the interest and the challenge above and beyond the individual questions themselves. So there definitely is a progression of difficulty, but that doesn't mean that students dip out in terms of the interest. Yeah, thanks, Kirsty. That was great. Let me jump to the concern then. Let me see, does anybody have any concerns about this? Anything that kind of sticks out that feels problematic, or any questions that they have at this stage, before I just talk about some of my experiences with this sequence?
I think it looks a bit daunting to a lot of children. I mean, I'm in a year 2, so even just putting 10 questions up on a slide is quite a lot for them. And even just on a worksheet. So we tend to do it in bits. Yeah. So they're chunked, so they feel that they can actually go and have a go at them. Because looking at that, I know even some of my most able would suddenly look at the triangles and think, oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm not saying they'll be able to, the progression of those questions, that they are more difficult than my age group, but it's just the idea of the layout.
It's a brilliant point, Hazra. Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, it's really interesting. This was something, it sounds daft to me. I've been teaching for 12 or 13 years before I started messing around with this particular thing. And that never dawned on me till about 6 months in, till I was I predominantly work with secondary students, as people know. But I'd bang up 10 questions like this to a GCSE foundation group, and they just put the pens down. They wouldn't even start because it was too much. They were overwhelmed by it. And it was only then that I realized, no, that I've got to change something here. So you're absolutely right. When I present this to probably most classes, certainly classes that I don't know particularly well, I'll do exactly as you suggest. I'll chunk it maybe into kind of strips of 4, maybe questions 1 to 4, followed by 5 to 8, followed by 9 and 10, or whatever feels appropriate. Because the last thing I want is to, as you say, overwhelm students so they just don't start. The thing I always say though at the end is it's important that the kind of questions all come back together, if that makes sense. I don't want students seeing questions 1 to 4 as a kind of sequence, and then as something new starts questions 5 to 8. So once they've finished questions 1 to 4, I want them to know that the next question along is related to what came before, so they don't see it as kind of discrete questions. But yeah, no, that's a really, really important point, Hazra. Thank you. Well, what I might do, if it's okay with everybody, I want to share with you quite a few sequences tonight, but I also want to kind of focus on kind of my experiences with doing this and also a bit of pedagogy. So just before we move on from this sequence, let me just share with you the answers. I'll just pick up a couple of things. So question 4 is quite an interesting one, you know, when you do this with students for the first time, because if you think of students who are doing a very algorithmic approach to this, dividing by the denominator, multiplying by the numerator, question 4 presents a bit of a problem in the sense that for the first time, we're getting a non-integer answer when we do 15 divided by 10. Now, this has been such a mistake in my teaching. You'll think I'm a terrible teacher here. Again, not for the first time. Like whenever I did fractions of an amount, all the answers were nice, tidy answers. And that was true of all my teaching. Things never got nasty. It was always nice, lovely answers. And there's a real problem with that, you know, because students get this nice, tidy world of how mathematics works. And anytime then they get a correct answer that looks a bit weird, students just assume it's wrong. And that's really, like, worst case, if that's in some high stakes exam like SAPS or GCSE, you can get kids thinking, oh, that can't be right, crossing it out and so on. So what I hope you'll see throughout the 3 or 4 sequences we do tonight is I try to include the weird, but include the weird early on so that students then kind of broaden their perception of what a concept involves. So I tease that in question 4 and then make that explicit in question 5. So question 4, we get a non-integer in the calculations if we're doing it without simplifying 2/10. But in question 5, we actually get that non-integer in terms of the answers, which may seem obvious to us that of course it's 4.5, but for a lot of students who are used to a nice tidy world of math, that presents potentially a bit of cognitive conflict. And then, of course, we're switching where this missing number appears, because I don't want students just doing an algorithm, divide by the bottom times by the top. I want them thinking, what does this actually mean? What strategies are we going to use, and so on. And then the other thing that, again, question 7, again, this may be the most obvious thing in the world to everybody watching this, but I never did improper fractions when I was doing fractions of an amount. I never did improper fractions when I was simplifying fractions. Fractions were always, the numerator was always smaller than the denominator. And kids saw improper fractions as just something that they changed to mixed numbers. That was all they ever did with them. Whereas now I want them to be a fundamental part of everything we do with fractions. Just like mixed numbers, there's nothing, I should have stuck a mixed number fraction in here. I want to keep developing my students' kind of fluency with fractions throughout this, so they don't get this very kind of boxed off, limited view of what it means when we do fractions of an amount. And then, of course, I often save a particularly weird answer for the end, as Kirsty said earlier on, so we have that increased amount of challenge when students finish. But finishing the sequence isn't the end of the story, as we're going to talk about in a second as well. So there's just a bit of an insight into this. I should say as well, I'm not claiming this is any good or anything like that. And I'm also not claiming that this is the first run through of this. I've never written a sequence of questions, and I've written 350 of these now, that survived intact after its first exposure to students, because students will pick up on things that I never intended and so on, and I'll find ways to improve it. So this has now survived about 3 classes, but it's gone through about 6 or 7 iterations, this particular sequence. I'll show you then where you can get free access to all of these, and as I say, hundreds more. But what I want to focus on now is what I'm trying to do with this. Well, what's the point in this, and why do people criticize me for this? Well, what I want to do is I want my students thinking mathematically. That's my ultimate aim. I think that's the aim of all teachers, right? Well, particularly when we're talking maths. We want our students to be mathematical thinkers. So the sequences of questions I'm going to be sharing with you tonight, I define as intelligent practice. And this is my working definition of what I'm trying to do. Just have a quick read of this. So notice there are 2 aspects to this. There's the surface level, which is just carrying out the method. And you can do those questions that I've just shown you. If you know how to do fractions of an amount, you can just work through those questions, treating them as 10 separate questions, and that's fine. You get your practice. But using the behavior I'm going to introduce to you now, I think I can provide those opportunities with the questions as a stimulus for students to think that bit deeper, to think mathematically. And what do I mean by think mathematically? I use John Mason's definition. This is my favorite definition of it. So I want my students to do those 4 things. Again, just have a quick read on that if you can see them. Now, the mistake I made in my teaching for many years is that this type of thinking was restricted to problem-solving activities. This is when I'd go on Enrich or wherever, and I'd try and find something to help my students think mathematically. The problem with that is that sometimes I never got round to that in the scheme of work, so I was running out of time. And often those tasks were a little bit too open-ended and a little bit less structured for some of my students. So they just found them quite frustrating. So what I want to do now is building this mathematical thinking throughout my practice. I argued before that practice is fundamental for students to understand mathematics, but I don't want that practice to be dry. I want to build in these opportunities for this mathematical thinking. So what I'm trying to do here is that I think there are 3 elements needed to help students think mathematically. The first is the task itself. If the task is rubbish, like if it's just 10 disconnected questions with nothing going on, that's not to say that has no place in the maths classroom, but in terms of getting students thinking deeper, no, it's not going to do it. So the task has got to have some potential for mathematical thinking in there. But that alone isn't enough. If I could, and I have given those 10 questions to some classes without any prep or anything, and it's bombed because students haven't had that support or that stimulus or that initiative to think mathematically. So the next key thing is the role of the students. The students have to be on board with what we're trying to get out of this. And that's what I'm going to focus on next. I'm going to try and teach my students a way of thinking, a way of approaching questions like that to enable them to think mathematically. But that alone is not enough. We've got an important role to play as the teacher. So I've got to model this way of thinking, because I'm going to cite research in a second to suggest that this does not come naturally to the vast majority of students. The vast majority of students would just work through those 10 questions and not spot anything, unfortunately. So we've got to be on hand to model, to support, to stretch, to discuss, and so on and so forth with our students. So in the short session tonight, I'm going to try and hopefully show you how I try to do this. So the way this works is I have this type of behavior that I call reflect, expect, check, explain. I'm a big believer in shared vocabulary. So if I'm going to be talking about reflect, expect, check, explain, I want my kids to be talking about it as well. I want my colleagues to be talking. So we're all talking about the same thing. So I can say to my students after a couple of weeks of doing this, I can say, okay, remember to reflect, or what do you do when you expect? So I want my students all talking the same language with this. So I'm going to show you a diagram now, and it may look a little bit weird at first. I'm going to show you, by the way, where you can get all the activities and all the diagrams from tonight in case you want to share them with your students or your colleagues or whatever. So this diagram may look a bit weird, but just take a moment just to look at it, and I'll try and explain what I'm getting at here. So this notion of reflect, expect, check, explain, again, it's nothing revolutionary or anything like that, but it's my way to hopefully stimulate my students and support my students to think mathematically. So I'm going to take you through each of the 4 stages with an example of what this may look like. But just to give you a bit of a background, every time my students encounter a question, whether this is me asking them one or they see it on a worksheet or on a PowerPoint or whatever it is, and it's one of these intelligent practice sequences, the first thing I want them to do is pause and reflect. Essentially, how does this question compare to the one that came before it? But I'll show you some prompts for this in a second. Then once they've reflected, does that tell them anything about what the answer might be to this new question before they work it out? Can they form any expectations whatsoever? Will it be bigger, smaller, the same, and so on? Now, reflect and expect work hand in hand to do what I call world building. They give students a bit of a perception about where their understanding is at this moment. They also give them a bit of skin in the game, because once you've formed an expectation about an answer, it means something to you. Far more so than if you just look at a question and crack on working it out. If you actually take a moment just to think, I expect this to happen, you'll then got a bit more engagement and a bit more interest in what actually does happen. So the students reflect and expect, and then they go ahead and answer the question using the method that they've been taught, what method they've got at their disposal, whatever you've modeled to them, whatever you've taught them, and so on. And then the final 2 things happen. So first they check, how does their answer compare to what they expected to happen? Is it the same? Is it different? So a quick check, compare their expectation to what actually happened. And then comes the most important part of the process, the explanation. If it does match what happened, fantastic. Now's a chance to think, how would I explain that to somebody who doesn't understand it yet? But if it doesn't match, if they're surprised, if their check doesn't match their expect, Here's their opportunity to think, what the flipping heck's going on here? Why is it a different? Can I try and figure it out? So that's an overview, and I'm just going to show you now each of these 4 stages in action. And then what we're going to look at, we're going to play around with another sequence, and then I'm going to look at how we can try and get our students to engage in this way of thinking as much as possible, because it's difficult, this. It's not natural for students, and I'll share some research on that in a second. So what does reflect look like? So let's go back to our sequence that we looked at a second ago, this one with the fractions of an amount. And let's imagine that your students are working through this as a worksheet, or it's projected on the board, or whatever it is. And let's say your students are up to this stage here. They've worked out that 2/5 of 15 is 6, and they get on to question 4. This is what I want them to do. I want them to pause and reflect. And the reflection prompts I give them, and I'll show you where you can access all these prompts, is this. I want them to just look at the previous one and think, what's changed, what stayed the same? It doesn't have to be long. They don't necessarily need to write anything down. We'll talk about that in a second. It's just that moment of pausing before they move on to doing another question. It sets this process up. It sets up this world building. So what's changed, what stayed the same? Just make a mental note of it if they're not going to be writing it down. Then comes the expect part. So let's imagine they're here, and let's imagine that they've noticed here when they did the reflect that the 2s remain the same, the 15s remain the same, but the denominator has gone from 5 to 10. Based on that reflection, is there anything that they can expect about this answer? Now, it doesn't need to be a specific number. It may be it's going to get bigger, it's going to get smaller, it's going to stay the same. And in some geometrical sequences that we'll look at later on, it may be that the answer is going to look different. Maybe flips the other way around or something, maybe different units, whatever it is. Is there anything that they can predict about this answer before they go ahead and work it out? So again, I give my students a series of prompts for this, and I'll share these prompts with you a little later on. Now, I made a huge mistake when I first started doing this. I didn't give my students support for this. I just said, what can you expect about the answer? And the problem is a lot of kids got bogged down in trying to work out the answer before they did their expectation, that they thought they needed a specific answer, and it defeated the object. So now I say, look, first thing, will it increase, decrease, or stay the same? What's your instinct tell you about this answer? And then, if possible, can you expect a specific value, but don't worry about it? Will it look different? Will the way you work it out change? And then this is just as important at the end. If you can't form an expectation, don't worry about it. Don't get bogged down in this. You've already done the hard work by doing the reflection. You're going to get another chance to reflect back on this a little later. So they do the expect, and this sets up. So now they've got skin in the game. Now, if they're buying into this, they're quite eager and excited to figure out what the actual answer is here, because they want to know whether they're right or not with this expectation. So now they go ahead and answer the question. They do the check. So they work out what the answer to 2/10 of 15 is. Now, they're not diving into this cold. In my model, in my way of doing this, they'll have been shown a worked example first, a very real basic way to do fractions of an amount. So they've got the skills. This is them practicing the skills, but hopefully in kind of a richer, deeper way. So they work out, check their expectation, check the answer using the method they've been taught. As I say, this is me, I have a danger of going off on a tangent, so I'll say this very briefly. This is kind of the way I sequence my teaching of mathematics now, how I plan everything out, the order things come. And the only thing you need to be aware of here is that we're talking about intelligent practice here. What precedes intelligent practice is a worked example, my example problem pair. Students are not going into this cold. They've been set up for this. They've not mastered it. They're not fluent in it. That's why they're doing the practice, but they've got some methods up their sleeve that they can use to do the check, if that makes sense. So they do the check, and now comes the most important bit and the most challenging bit for us as teachers and for our students. It's the explain bit. Now, the whole point of explain is based on a series of research that I was completely ignorant of for 13 years, and now I'm a little bit obsessed about, and it's research into what's known as the self-explanation effect. Now, this is really big in cognitive science, but it's kind of been a bit slow to find its way into the classroom. And particularly for mathematics, this has got huge implications. So very briefly, the self-explanation effect is this finding here. Just have a read of that. So if students can engage in this behavior I'm going to talk about in a moment, it can do so much. It helps new knowledge start mixing in, integrating with existing knowledge. That's important. It refines existing mental models. So if students have got some misconceptions, this self-explanation behavior can help hopefully resolve those misconceptions. And crucially for mathematicians, it can improve the acquisition of problem-solving skills. So what happens is when students, they work out the answer, doing check, and then they may look and think, oh, it matches my expectation. Fantastic. So they experience what I call affirmation. They feel great. They think, wow, that's what has happened there is exactly what I predicted to happen. And I think that feels a lot better than if it's just a random question and then the answer comes up and you just tick it and move on. You've actually, because you've thought about this, you've formed an expectation about this. So what happens here is they start to realize that they understand it a bit deeper than they thought they did. And as I say, I'm going to give you a prompt in a second that helps the students think even deeper about this. But what happens if students' expectation doesn't match the check? What happens if there's a discrepancy there? Well, then students are surprised. And this surprise is potentially really powerful as well, because this triggers something in students. It's this cognitive conflict. They think, you know what, I thought something was going to happen. It didn't happen. So it begs the natural question of why? What is going on here? I thought the answer was going to change and it stayed the same. I thought it was going to go bigger and it's gone smaller. So you get this surprise. And that's really, really, really powerful for students to experience this surprise and realize that surprise is just a natural thing. And you can already see that your way of setting this up with the students is going to be so important. Your knowledge of your students to manage this surprise, to see this, to paint this as a positive thing is going to be so important. We'll talk more about that in a second. So this all sounds well and good, but surely students just do this naturally, right? They don't need this stupid reflect, expect, check, explain thing. Well, it turns out they don't. The vast majority don't do this. The vast majority of students will just work through these questions willy-nilly. They won't spot connections. They'll just bang through them, do question 3, then do question 4, and so on. The ones that do it naturally, and this isn't my phrase, this is in the research, is the high ability, or as I would say, the higher achieving students. They're the ones who'll do this. They're the ones who are naturally curious. They're the ones who, once they get an answer, before they move on to the next one, will just take a moment to look back and reflect. The majority of students don't do that. So the majority of students, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, will benefit from this supporting structure that will help them start to think mathematically and gain all these benefits from the self-explanation effect. So what does this look like in practice? Well, let's go back to this. Let's imagine students have got to question 3 and worked it out. They've reflected on the difference. They formed an expectation. Some students may have expected it to double. That's a really common one because 5's doubled to 10, so 6 is going to double to 12. Some students may have expected it to go from up by 5. It's gone from 5 to 10, so this will go from 6 to 11. Some students will have expected it to halve, and it does halve. Lots of different expectations will happen here. So now is the opportunity for the student to engage in this explanation behavior. So if the students couldn't form an expectation before, don't worry about it. Now that you've seen what the answer is, can you think about that relationship? If you did form an expectation and you're surprised, how would you explain it? Now you've seen that it goes from 6 to 3, how are you going to explain that? And if it's exactly what you expected to happen, don't think that's you done and dusted, because that's poor differentiation, that. If the answer doesn't surprise you, how would you explain it to somebody who doesn't understand it yet? So no matter what happens in this cycle, when students get to explain, even if they couldn't form an expectation, even if the expectation doesn't match check, even if the expectation does match check, with explain, every student's got something to do. Now, a couple of things. I'm not saying this is the right thing to do. I believe it is. I'm certainly not saying this is easy to get your students behaving in this way. And what we're going to focus on for the remainder of the session is how we increase those odds, how we try, what have I learned from students and teachers all around the world about how they get their kids to engage in this and the power it can do. But I genuinely believe if we can get the structure right and find the way to make it work for our kids, coupled with these sequences, students can have a really, really, really rich experience of mathematics. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you another sequence, and I'm going to get you, just like we did before, get you to work on it as a mathematician. And then I'm going to put you in your breakout groups and you can reflect on what I've chatted about here, particular in relation to this new sequence that you're going to work on, and see if it makes sense. And crucially, what would it look like for you in your classroom? That's what I'm fascinated about. So I think we'll do, I'm going to show you a few kind of curveballs a little later on, but I think we'll play it relatively safe now. I'm going to do a conversion of units one, centimeters and meters. So straight out of kind of year 4, year 5, mathematics programs of study. Nothing special about this sequence. Again, I'm not claiming it's a good one or anything. I'm going to take, I think it was Hazra's point from before. I am going to show you all the questions on the screen at once, but I wouldn't advise doing this. I'm just going to do it for simplicity here with this, but there's definite risk of cognitive overload. There's actually 18 questions in this sequence, and your challenge is to just do the conversions, centimeters to meters. So work your way through these. Are these any good? Is it one of the worst things you've ever seen? Just do it on your own as a mathematician, and then you're going to have an opportunity to go in your breakout groups and tear this apart in a few minutes' time. So here is your second sequence. I'll just give you another kind of 30 seconds or so. Again, I'm not expecting you to finish this or anything, but just another 30 seconds, then we're going to go into breakout groups. Okay, I feel like a proper teacher. I'm going to just ask you to finish the question that you're working on. And then what I'm going to ask Helen and Viv to do in a sec is to put you back into your breakout groups. Again, two things I'd like you to reflect on this time, if that's all right. So thinking back to what I said about reflect, expect, check, explain, does that feel like something that is useful, is a useful framework, this notion of world building with reflect, expect, and then self-explaining with check, explain? Is that something that you would buy into, that you think you could get your students engaging with? And then secondly, what about this sequence? Is this any good? Is this too much? Is this a useful sequence with converting units? And then again, when we come back, I'll just share with you a couple of experiences I've had with this, and then we'll talk about specific strategies that teachers have come up with to try and get their students to engage more with this way of thinking. So two things. What do you think of reflect, expect, check, explain? And what do you think of this sequence? Helen and Viv, could I ask you to pop people back into breakout groups, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. I'll press the button now. Thank you. Okay, Craig, I think everybody's back in the room now. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, just on this one, I won't throw this out to the floor just because I just want to get through a couple more sequences, if that's okay. But just a couple of things I've tried to do with this, and what I've noticed when I've shared this one with I've been lucky enough to do primary and secondary with this particular sequence, is that students find it tough, but hopefully tough in a good way. I wanted to include the weird, as I've mentioned before. For too long, my students' experiences of unit conversions was like 1.5 meters is this, 3.2 is this. Even things like 370 meters into centimeters, I don't think I did enough. I certainly didn't do enough things like this, 0.03007. So I want to confront students with the weird early on so that it just becomes normal. It just becomes that's a perfectly acceptable answer. I want them to experience that. Also, and again, this will be the most obvious thing in the world, I wanted method selection to be involved here. I wanted students to not just have an exercise on converting one way. I wanted that kind of switch to happen. And you'll notice the switch happens between 8 and 9. It happens again between 14 and 15. It happens again between 17 and 18. The switch was the bit my students found the most difficult. So I'll show you actually a follow-up exercise I wrote on this in a second as well, just to try and make that switch even more kind of jarring in a way, because that's what I want. I want to throw my students off autopilot, kick them off their algorithms and get them thinking a little bit deeper about this. And again, we'll notice the consistency of the numbers. It's always a 3, it's always a 0, it's always a 7 throughout this entire sequence, so that when the answer changes, there's less that's changed in the input, so students can attribute that change to what's changed as we go forward, if that makes sense. Just on this, so this will set up something we're going to talk about just at the end. I wrote a kind of sequel to this that's possibly more challenging or just kind of different. It's one of my fill in the gap activities that are also on my variation theory site that I'll show you, but I'll just show you what this looks like. Now, again, to take the earlier point, you don't want it to be too kind of daunting for students. So perhaps, you chop up and just show rows 1, 2, and 3 or something at a time. But can I just ask you just to take just 2 minutes on your own, just have a look at this. And is this doing something different than the previous sequence? Would the same reflect, expect, check, explain behavior work for this sequence as well? Just take a moment to look at this, just to see what your thoughts are on this one. And I should say, by the way, the idea, of course, is to go through the row. So 1 kilometre is how many meters, is how many centimetres, how many millimetres, and so on. I should have made that clear. Now, again, on this one, we don't need to spend any more time on this. I just wanted to show you. I'm going to show you another type of activity that uses this framework for a different area of mathematics a little later. But I just wanted just to show you this now. Some teachers prefer this to the previous set of 18. Some people prefer the 18 questions. Some people use them together. We'll use this, as I say, as a sequel to the previous one. It does a similar thing. It's just that students answer a hell of a lot more questions in this grid, perhaps without realizing it. And there's a lot more method selection going on. There's a lot more jumping between units. You can cover 4 different length metric units in this one, whereas we only covered 2 in the previous one. And there's a lot more kind of sophistication required in terms of powers of 10 with decimals and so on and so forth. So again, I'm not throwing this out there as it's any better or any worse than the previous one. It's just an alternative that's also available. We'll touch more upon this a little later on. So what I wanted to turn my attention to now is how do we get our students behaving in this way? Because we've seen from research into self-explanation effect that students will just plow through and not look for connections, and certainly not when they've got an answer, pause and look back. It tends to be, I've got my answer, now let me crack on with the next question. Whereas with reflect, expect, check, explain, once students have got their answer, that's when the real hard thinking starts. That's when I want them to think, am I surprised? Do I understand it? And so on. So how do we get our students doing this? So this is where kind of writing it down is going to come into play. Some form of kind of committing these thoughts to paper. Now, before we go into this, I'd just like you to take a moment on your own just to have a reflection here. You've now seen 2 sequences, or kind of 2 and a bit with just that extra one. What's your instinct? What does your instinct tell you? Thinking about the age group of students you teach, thinking about your knowledge of your students, what would you want them to write down when they're working through those sequences of questions? Would it be a reflect, expect, check, explain for every question? Would it be just one of those things for every question? Would it just be some of those things for some of the questions? What would you want? What feels realistic? Just take a moment on your own just to consider it. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to share with you a few different ideas, and I'm going to ask you to go back in your breakout rooms and just reflect on this. So just take a moment. What would you want your students to write down for those sequences of questions? Okay, now writing it down is really interesting because it presents us with a challenge. We've got kind of 2 conflicting aims going on here. We want our students to be able to communicate mathematically. We want them to be able to write in mathematics. Now, you'll know as well as I do that students are often reluctant to do this. But if you look at any SATs examiner's report or any GCSE examiner's report, you can be sure that the poorest answered questions are the ones that ask students to explain, discuss, describe, and so on and so forth. Students seem reluctant to do this. So if we get students to write things down, write down their explanations, write down their reflections, on the positive, this is one way to help them get better at this, help them get better at communicating mathematically, better at writing. But of course, the flip side to that is it's going to slow them down, particularly if you've got younger students, particularly if you've got students who have literacy issues, then flipping out, getting them to write one of these things down for every question, they're not going to get anywhere. And that's going to be really frustrating for students because they're going to want to engage in the mathematical thinking, but it's the writing that's going to slow them down. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with this trade-off? So I'm going to share with you a few ideas, and I'm going to ask you to go in your breakout groups and just reflect. Would any of these work for you? What's your instinct for getting students to engage with this? So a few examples here. So one is that the students just don't have any structure to it. This is an example of a lesson I was watching. It was on straight line graphs, but the topic's neither here or there. And students just had a blank whiteboard, and each time they would just answer the question on the whiteboard, and the teacher would trust them to be thinking about it, trust them to be engaging in reflect, expect, check, explain. Holding up whiteboard, sometimes he'd say to them, write me down your expectations, hold it up. So just a bit more free and easy, no kind of definite structure to it. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end is we have a template where we expect students to write something down for each thing. They have the question there, they write down their reflection, they say what they think is going to happen, they show their working, that they've checked it, and then they write their explanation. Now, this is going to get the kids great at communicating mathematically if they actually buy into it and if they have the time to go through it. That's the downside of this. And lots of teachers who have kind of taken my courses and kind of taken this on have devised their own templates for students where they copy the question out for them and then they ask the students, how's the question change and so on, but still fitting around this idea of a template, still fitting around this idea that we want our students to engage and reflect, expect, check, explain for each question. Some templates look fairly simple like that. I'm not a big fan of when you have all kind of squished up writing here. I much prefer it when the templates kind of flip the other way around so the students can write a bit more here. So some are like that. This is quite nice. Those reflect, expect, check, explain prompts that I shared with you before, and I'll show you where you can get these. Some teachers use these as a way to kind of stimulate students to think about each of those things. And anytime they think about something, kind of jot it down, but it's still a hell of a lot of writing that is going to be off-putting for some students. Some teachers get their kids doing it in books, just kind of doing their reflection, their expectation, and so on. That can work really, really well as well. And again, it's quite nice. They can write kind of as much as they like. They don't have that kind of constraint of trying to squeeze things into a box and so on. And it looks nice in books. You've got the mathematics, but then you've got the writing involved. What do I think is going to happen and so on and so forth. I'll just share this one with you as well before I kind of just show you a few other examples. This was a course I ran last year, again, for secondary teachers, but the topic doesn't matter at all. It was on rotating shapes around a given point. And the teacher brought this in. He took a photo of it and brought this in. It was this lad's work. It was a bottom set year 10 GCSE foundation group. And he was so pleased with what this lad had done. And I looked at it and I thought, what's going on here? Like, he's just written it rotated for each of the explanations and so on. But the point the teacher made was this was a lad who would never write anything down in maths. He'd do the bare minimum, just stick the answer down, never do any working out or anything like that. But there was something about the fact that he was being asked to reflect and expect, form a prediction. And then he was so proud any time that prediction turned out to be true that he wanted to write something down, or even so surprised any time it turned out not to be, that he wanted to try and figure it out, that it stimulated him to do more writing than ever in his maths lessons. So I'm not saying this is going to work all the time, but there is something about this that may cause some students to want to write a little bit more than they would do normally. It's great for group work as well. If you have kind of a central sheet, let's say your kids are working in groups of 2, you have a central sheet where they record, but the kids discuss together and then take it in turns to write stuff down. That this can work really, really well for the reflect, expect, check, explain, and so on. But I'll just show you my favorite at the moment, my favorite approach at the moment, because I still think, particularly thinking of a primary audience, and even again, when I speak to secondary teachers, for a lot of kids and for a lot of classes, that's a hell of a lot of writing to be doing. And that can really get in the way of this mathematical thinking. So here are some of my favorite ways that teachers have found to make this work. And after this, you'll be pleased to know I'm going to shut up. You can go in your breakout groups and see, would any of these work for you? So one is a kind of a more simple template where instead of having reflect, expect, check, explain, there's one box here and it simply says, how's the question changed? How's the answer changed? And this is for a simple addition, a sequence of questions. And what was nice, when the teacher used this, he said to his students, look, don't worry if you can't fill the box out before you answer, let's say question B. If you want to answer question B first, then look at your answer and then fill the box out, that's fine. And it just gave the kids a little bit more freedom. There wasn't as much to write. They could choose when they wrote things down. And this seemed to work quite well. So reducing the number of boxes from 4 down to 1. And it was kind of just a general, almost kind of what do you notice box. That seemed to work quite well. Reduce the writing, but keeps the thinking up there. This is my favorite. I think this is brilliant. So this was primary. This was a year 6. We're doing averages and range. So the sequence of questions was on working out the range from a list of data. Absolutely, again, absolutely fine. Just a fairly nice sequence of questions from the site. But here was the brilliance that the teacher came up with. I thought this was absolutely excellent. I've since nicked this. I think it's just such a good idea. The teacher said, work your way through these questions, and anytime you notice something interesting, write it down. Now, the beauty of that was there was no requirement to write something down for each question, but the power was given to the kid when you spot something interesting, when you see something that you want to tell people about. In other words, when you see something you understand, write about it. So it was just that opportunity to kind of share that relationship that they spotted. So maybe for one child, it would be between questions 2 and 3. They found that interesting. Another child between questions 5 and 6. But removing that kind of requirement and giving the power to the students for this particular class, that seemed to work really well. I've since seen this replicated. So again, this is a secondary example. This is a year 9 class, I think this was, on calculating an estimate of the mean. And notice this is a particularly neat book. Some of them are absolute terrible, I'm sure you can imagine. But notice, for example, question 4 here, the students just worked out the answer. Whereas question 3, they've spotted something. So again, the teacher had said, if you spot something that you find interesting, that you think you can explain, write it down. This seems to be the way to get students to buy into this a bit more. So as a result, I start using a template more along these lines now. If I'm going to use any template, I tend to copy the questions out for the students. I don't want them wasting the time writing the questions down unless it's a real quick thing to do. I ask them to form an expectation, but I don't ask them to put the reason. They can just put up, down, they can put stay the same, they can put a number in. I need them to have done that because, as I say, that gives them their skin in the game. So they're reflecting mentally and they're just committing an expectation to paper. I want them to do their working out, but again, this is just my kind of preference with this. I want them to do their working out, but then their explanation, they can just choose whichever one they want. Choose the one they find the most interesting and try to explain it to somebody who doesn't understand it yet. And maybe you do that at the end of the lesson, or maybe after the kids have been working for 10, 15 minutes, you stop and say, look back at your work, pick the most interesting relationship and write about it, whatever works. But I think this balance between trying to get kids to write things down, but not slowing their thinking down, this for me seems to be certainly at the moment, my favorite way of getting that balance right. But only you'll know yourself with your students and so on. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to go back into your breakout groups, think about the sequences that we've done so far, think about your own students, and think about these ideas I've shared. What would you ask them to write down? How would you structure this? If you think there's any worth in this idea, this way of thinking at all, what would you want your students to write down for it? So Helen, could I ask you to set up the breakout groups first, please? And if we just reflect on this idea of writing it down.
Yeah, sure. I'll open them now. Okay, that's all the breakout rooms closed. Welcome back, colleagues. Over to you, Craig.
Fantastic. Thanks, Helen. And thank you to Hazra, who's posted a really good comment in the chat there. In year 2, we asked students what they notice and put post-it notes into their books. Discussion leads to more children noticing patterns and relationships. This is the key. It's whatever it takes for your students just to pause, reflect, whether you follow the reflect, expect, check, out framework or whatever, just to pause and then start to build up this mathematical communication is that's the key to it for me. Right, so for the final 10 minutes of me chatting, before we do a few question and answers at the end, I just want to show you kind of the variety, the scope of this, because I've started with some kind of number-based sequences here, and there's a danger that we think that this just works for number stuff, but I use this with everything. Anything I want my students to practice, any method procedure I want my students to practice, I believe that practice can be improved by thinking a bit more carefully about the sequencing of this. So I'll show you a few examples of this. I'll just show you one. I'll just spend 10 seconds on this. A colleague wrote this for me because I'm useless at this particular area of maths, and that is again, it's secondary, but this hopefully you'll appreciate it. Plans and elevations. I can't do this. I can't picture things in 3D. I'm absolutely terrible at it. And there's this topic we have to teach at GCSE, and I can never teach it, which is to draw the plan view and the front elevation of 3D shapes. I simply just can't do it. I'm useless at it every single time. Whereas this sequence of questions is really nice because normally it's here's a random shape, draw the different views of it. And you can imagine this working with any 3D shape, any topic you may be teaching that requires students to visualize or represent from 3D to 2D. If we just sequence our examples a bit more carefully, what we get now with this is the relationship. Once you've figured out this first question here, then it's what's changed. Let's do the reflection. How do I think that's going to impact my plan and my elevation? And sometimes it'll change one, but not change the other, and so on. And then I can try and draw it and see if it matches my answer or my partner's answer. And what this does by holding things constant and changing one thing, it draws my attention to what's changed and the impact it's had on the answer. So it seems to work well for, again, geometry things, algebraic things, number, data, and so on. But I want to finish just with two completely different sequences. One that I'll show you briefly, and one we'll spend a couple of minutes on if that's all right with everybody. So I have a different, I'll take you on a tour of the website just at the end where you can get all these. But I have a different type of sequence on there that I call demonstrations. And I wrote this particular activity because, again, I like to use data to inform where students are struggling. What I found was that students are pretty good at doing area when counting squares, as long as the squares are either full squares or half squares. As soon as you get things where they have to do a bit of reasoning, where it's either more than half or less than half, you either get them estimating or they just kind of fall back on kind of techniques they've used in the past. So just take a moment to look at this question. I'll just show you the results of this. This startled me a little bit, this one. The youngest student to answer this on the data, I think was a 6-year-old, again up to 16 with this one. It's only answered correctly 53% of the time. The most popular choice of answer here to this one is 3.5. And again, if I just pick an explanation out, you get students that they're not using things about areas of triangles. They're not using kind of fill in a 3x2 rectangle and halve it. They're just kind of guessing a little bit. You've got two full squares, which again is a bit dodgy straight away. And then you've got half squares, which again is a bit dodgy, and so on. They seem to struggle with this. But then it all kicks off whenever you get weird looking triangles like this. Whenever you get particularly shapes like B, and you ask students to work out the area of that, well, anything could be happening. Any of those numbers could be being multiplied together. And again, this doesn't seem to matter the age of the students. It's misconception central. So a question like this, again, is only answered correctly 51% of the time. So to cut a long story short, I wanted something to help address this. Now, as maths teachers, we're laughing. We've got so much technology kind of up our sleeve. But I think I've made a mistake with technology for demonstrating geometrical concepts for many, many years. So I'll show you what I used to do, and I'll show you what I do now. And again, you can play around with this. It's all freely available on the website. So if I just click on this, and this link is on the website that I'll show you in a second. This is just a very, very simple, really straightforward GeoGebra applet that I've built. And this is on my variation theory website. And I'll show you how to access it in a second. If I just crack it open, let's say I was trying to teach you as a class area of a triangle, starting with the basics from counting squares and so on and so forth. What I've done in the past is I've always been into my technology, but I've just used one example and then I've changed things. So I've said this, I've said, okay, let's establish that the area of that's 10. And then I've said, okay, what do you think happens when I drag point A up to here? And you'd have made predictions, perhaps on mini whiteboards and so on. And then I'd have shown you, oh, it increases by this. Now, what do you think happens if I change point C to here and so on? Now, the problem with that is I'm relying on your memory of what it used to be like. I'm relying on you to remember that I've moved it up from there, which is okay, but it's an additional thing that you've got to think of. It's like me showing you a sequence of those questions that we looked at before. And every time you finish one question, it just dissolves and disappears. You've never got it to refer back to. And you'd never do that with a set of questions. So why do it with examples? So I just came up with the idea, and it's the most obvious idea in the world, but I'll always have two examples side by side. So I'll always have a reference point. And it makes a world of difference, because what this means is this now. Once we've established that the areas are 10, what I can do is I can turn off this area, and now I can say, what do you think happens when I do that? So now students don't have to remember what it was before, what the area was before, or anything like that. They've got that direct comparison there. So they get that variation. They get what stayed the same, positions B and C, or E and F in this case. They get what's changed. They can form an expectation. They can then try and work it out, discuss it with their partner or whatever. And then the check is me revealing the answer. And then I can pause, and they can then try and figure out, is that what they expected to happen or not? But what that then sets up is then I can do lots of nice things. So I can do, okay, so we've seen what happens there. Let's reset things. Now let me do that. So if a student's missed what I've done, it doesn't matter, because they can look back and see what's happened. Okay, yeah, he must have increased the base by 1. So now what do we think happens now? And if students are engaging in reflect, expect, check, explain, they may expect the same thing to happen. It makes sense. You've increased 1 length. When you did this, the area went to 12.5. So surely when you do this, the area's also got to go to 12.5. When we reveal it and it goes to 12, it begs the question, what's going on here? Why? So for me, it's the same thing as everybody's always been doing, but the fact that we've now got two examples side by side, for me, makes a hell of a difference to it. And then, of course, we can start to target some of those misconceptions. So once we've established that the area is 10, I can say, okay, what happens if I do that? Does the area change? Does the area stay the same? And again, we don't have that memory. We don't have to fall back on it. It's not, the question hasn't dissolved the previous question. It's there by the side. And once we establish that that's 10, then we can start to do the ones that students always get wrong. What's that going to be now? Can you work that out now? We get that we can figure out that it's invariant, and then we can start playing with the dynamic software and showing that it always stays the same. But it only has its power for me if we have that constant to refer back to, that fixed example. So I do this with everything now, whether it's perimeter, whether it's angles or whatever. I will always have two examples side by side, one which is the frame of reference, the other where the variation happens. And again, that's probably the most obvious thing you've ever heard in your life, but I missed it for about 12 or 13 years. So I just wanted to share that with you. And again, I'll show you how you can access these at the end. But I just wanted to end with one other thing, if that's okay. So let me hop back to my PowerPoint. I showed you before an example of a fill in the gaps activity for units of length. I find these really powerful. Students find these hard, but there's so much maths involved. So I thought I'd finish on a ratio one, if that's okay. So I'm talking year 6 here, and this is certainly something that I'd be doing in year 7, 8 and 9. For me, my year 10s and 11s are worse at ratio than my 7s, 8s and 9s, because they've not been brought up on a bar modeling diet, so they don't have this visual way of doing it. So I just wanted to share with you this. Now, again, I'm going to go back to Hazra's point that this may be kind of overwhelming, so we've got to think carefully how it's presented. But I wonder if you can just spend, what can we allow on this, 2 or 3 minutes, if that's all right. How many of these gaps could you fill in? And how do you think your students will get on with this? How would you want them working on this? What would you want them writing down for this one? So I'll shut up for a few minutes and then just have a play around with this. Working kind of row at a time. How many of these gaps can you fill out? Is this a useful activity or not? Then I'll just share with you a few thoughts before we do question and answers. Okay, just a couple of things from me on this sequence and the fill in the gaps in particular. There's loads of these on the site. I'll show you one of my favorites again in a second. There's a couple of interesting things going on with these. There's variation happening both across and down. So the variation that's happening across is, of course, the information that you've been given. Sometimes you're told the ratio, sometimes you're told Jenny's amount, blah, 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 blah. But also there's relationships going on downwards. So if, for example, we've finished row 2, then you'll see here that there's a relationship between row 2 and 3. Jenny's amount remains invariant, whereas now Jenny's not getting £8 more, she's getting £8 less. So before students fill out row 3, they can hopefully reflect what's changed, what stayed the same. What do they expect to happen? Will any of these boxes be the same? Will some go up? Will some go down? Then they can work it out, hopefully using bar models, and then check. Were they surprised by it? How would they explain it to someone who struggled, and so on? My favorite way for actually doing these activities was shared with me by a teacher who I was doing some work with. I would have never thought of this. I think it's absolutely brilliant. She always does these in pairs, but in a really specific way. So each pair of students gets one of these sheets, ideally done a bit bigger, maybe A3, but A4 works absolutely fine. And that becomes the central recording sheet. The students then have just a couple of blank pieces of paper on their own, or their books. They do their working out independently, but then they've got to agree on an answer before they put it in the central recording sheet. So what that does is students get all their kind of independent thoughts to see what they know themselves, and then they get that collaboration before it goes in the sheet. I always now do that with fill in the gaps activities. I think that works really, really, really well for these. And again, there's so much maths, there's so much potential for good thought going on here. But for me, for the majority of students, it will only happen if they have that guidance. And for me, that guidance, that structure is reflect, expect, check, explain. The other one I was talking about, I wrote this for primary, but I use this with year 11 so much, is time. My 15, 16-year-olds are absolutely useless when it comes to this time. So I wrote this sequence. I wrote, again, another fill in the gaps. We won't do this now, but just in case you want to use it, there's 10 questions on this. And in theory, all you need to be able to do is tell the time and work out some differences. But God almighty, this causes some trouble, this one. So again, I've tried to build in variation across and up and down. There's relationships going on. I've tried to target AM, PM. Any misconception I could think of, I've tried to build into these. I thought this was going to be a 10, 15-minute activity for year 10 and 11. This has gone on for days, this one. Because again, that's just the first 5 questions. It all kicks off when we start getting into these ones as we go through. So anyway, there's another sequence that you can play around with if you want. Just if I could ask you, I'm just going to take you on a quick tour of the website, but if you have any questions and answers, now's a really good time to type them into the chat. And Helen and Viv are going to be monitoring this. And then after I've taken you on a quick tour of the site, I'll answer any questions that you may have. So whilst you're thinking of questions, I'll just go to my site, variationtheory.com. It doesn't require a login or anything like that. It's just a very simple blog. I just do it kind of in my spare time. The way it's organized is the easiest way to access it is just via the topics. So if you go to the topics menu on the top, you'll see I've broken it down into number, algebra, geometry, stats, and A-level. If you go to number, and let's say you go to decimals and give that a click, that will bring up obviously all the decimal activities. The blue ones are the ones we've talked about tonight. The blue ones are the sequences of questions, what I call intelligent practice, that have reflect, expect, check, explain. The green ones are something different. The green ones are what I call rule activities. I talk about these in my book and my online course, but they're something different. That's where you've got examples and non-examples of facts, of it's good for definitions and so on. Anyway, you can have a look around at that. We've seen the orange ones, which are my demonstration activities. We saw that with area of a triangle. And I also have pink ones where I have patterns that students have to continue the pattern, but then the pattern breaks and they have to try and figure out what's going on and so on. I put pedagogical notes with each of these as you go through. So if you go to Please Read, there's notes on each of the different types of activities, top tips that I've picked up, further reading, and so on and so forth. So I've tried to make it as kind of clear as possible how these could be used. And every time you use an activity, when you click into one of these, I present all the images, but then what I also put is a downloadable version. There's always a downloadable, editable PowerPoint, so we can go back to Hazra's point. And if you want to strip out some of the questions or change it, then it's all fully adaptable to do whatever you want with it. As I say, a lot of people say I talk nonsense with this, but I'm just trying to find ways to make my practice as useful as possible, and hopefully other people's. I get sent in sequences from all around the world very regularly on these, and I always put them up there. if any of you were, again, I never asked for any money or anything like that, but if any of you ever wanted to write a sequence, particularly from a primary perspective, very few things would make me as happy. And again, there's lots of opportunity to get involved there. So I'll shut up now and let's have kind of the last 5 minutes or so. Helen and Viv can fire some questions at me and I'll do my best to answer them.
Viv, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Thank you, Craig. That's lovely. Saliha has left a comment about some of the NCTM materials. Saliha, do you want to come in and say something about those?
Hi.
Hi.
Hiya.
Hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, when Craig was speaking about communicating mathematically, well, at our school, we use the NCTM STEM sentences, which are really good to help us with our reasoning. I come from a school with almost 80 to 90% of EAL children, so it really helps us to reason. So we use the STEM sentences, and the children can then go off and explain and structure their sentences, and it just supports them with their reasoning. So I just think it's a really, really good tool to use in class.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks, Saliha. And there's a question from Laura about Key Stage 1 examples. I'm wondering, Craig, are there any particular ones that you can draw our attention to on the website?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Again, I always say this, you could not pay me to teach primary. God, I will be so out my depth, flipping heck, it's not even funny. The youngest I've ever seen this working with is with year 2. Again, nothing to do with me. I was just lucky enough to run a workshop and the teacher invited me in to see. Your best bet is probably the number stuff, and it's probably kind of the basic arithmetic stuff. So there's some decent stuff on mental addition, times tables, multiplying, subtraction, and so on and so forth. That's probably your best place to start in terms of, and again, that will be equally suitable for older students as well, but that's probably your best place to start. And hopefully, again, once you've got the basic idea and the structure, as I say, anything you teach, I think, can be adapted in this way. I just write for what I'm teaching, if that makes sense. So hopefully the teachers will, fingers crossed, find ways to make this work far beyond my capabilities. But yeah, I think the number arithmetic would be a decent place to start.
Thanks, Craig. Laura and I actually also both got the same question for you. So, Laura, do you want to come in with that one about creating resources?
Sorry, I was just unmuting.
That's okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking for my stuff, if we're moving forward and we want to incorporate the intelligent practice, what would be your top 5 tips or top 5 things to think about when we're creating activities or worksheets that use that intelligent practice approach? Or that variation theory.
Yeah, it's a really, really good idea. A really, really good question, Laura. And this sounds like a terrible plug. I have a full chapter in my book about making this work for teachers, but I'll give you the kind of abbreviated version here.
Yeah, I've got your book.
It's a good doorstop, I'll tell you that one. I'll give you the abbreviated version is do it collaboratively, but I have quite a specific way of doing this. So let's say, for example, you wanted to create a sequence of questions on ratio, just to pick a topic out of the blue. What works quite nice is if you, with another colleague or 2 or 3 colleagues or whatever you've got, if you agree upon a starting question, let's say we're going to do simplify, I don't know, 10 to 2 or something like that. And then give every colleague the challenge of trying to write, let's say, 5 questions that build upon that and see where they take it. And then once you've got, 3 or 4 different sequences, all starting with that same question stem, come together and see where you've gone with it. And what inevitably happens is that colleagues have gone off in different directions. And between you can then come up with, let's say, a 10-question sequence that brings together all the best ideas. I think that works well. What doesn't work as well is if 2 people sit together and try and at the same time come up with a sequence between them, because then you end up with a compromise or people arguing and people aren't exactly happy with whether. If you each write your own sequence and then come together and compare, that's when I see the best sequences are being written. So that would be my kind of top tip for collaboratively writing them. My other tip would be, in terms of introducing these to students, Definitely decide upon what you want the kids to write down. That feels important as well. Definitely tell the students why you're doing this, because I've made this mistake in the past. I think this is a good idea. The kids don't have a flipping clue what I'm talking about. They get annoyed because all of a sudden I'm telling them to write stuff down and spot things and so on. So tell the kids what we're trying to do, or why we're trying to do it, why noticing things is important, why communicating is important, why thinking hard is important, and so on and so forth. And just try and kind of build up, start off with a nice easy one, trying to build up that routine with the students before you kind of do the more complicated ones. But yeah, collaboration to write them, I think, needs to be managed carefully, and introducing it to kids needs to be managed carefully as well. I hope that helps a little bit, Laura. Anyway, it's a very, very good question.
Lovely, thank you so much, Craig. Helen, have we got time for any more questions? I'm just keeping an eye on the clock.
Conscious, yeah, that's it. We are a few minutes over, so perhaps if we sort of thank Craig and close it off there. But if people want to stay behind, if they've got a specific burning question or issue, Craig, are you okay to?
Yeah, I can do 5 minutes or more. I've just got to go and pick my little boy up, but 5 minutes is absolutely fine. No problem at all.
So, but for colleagues that do need to leave, thank you, Craig, on behalf of colleagues. Another absolutely packed session with so much for us to take away. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Thank you, colleagues, for being with us. I've just posted a link to the feedback form. As you know, your feedback's so important to us to help us to move these things forward for next time and our meetings next term. You should have had that email to you as well as a link, but if you could click on that link now, that would be fantastic. I'll email you soon with how you can access the recording for this session and the resources and information about what will happen in the summer term, because we won't be back face to face, sadly. It will be another online session, but we'll confirm that in due course. So thanks to colleagues who need to leave, and we've got another 5 minutes with Craig, hopefully, for those who can stay. Thank you.
Okay, so shall I bring in the other two questions that have come in? Jim was asking, these might sort of connect in some ways. I'll give you them both at the same time. Jim was asking about the challenge of sort of quick children or clever children or higher attaining, whatever language you want to use here, just shouting out the answers and sort of shifting that emphasis to the sort of explanations. And Lynn's sort of question also coming from Key Stage 1 is the question about multiple choice with year 2 and what they notice and sort of getting them started. So Lynn, you might want to add a little bit about that if you're still here. Make sure I've sort of understood your question properly. Maybe Lynn, I know Lynn had difficulty with her microphone last time. So Lynn's question is about multiple choice with young children, and Jim's is about helping children to avoid just kind of shouting out.
I can certainly answer Jim's. I'm not 100% sure I understand the other question. I'll answer Jim's and then I'll see if I can, see if we can figure out what's going on with the other. It's a big big problem. First, well, there's a practical way we can do it, and then there's a more long-term cultural way that we can do it. So the practical way is that an approach I often use with these sequences, I call it the 4-2 approach. And that is 4 minutes of the students working in silence independently on a sequence, and then 2 minutes collaboration with the person next to them. And then back to 4 minutes, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes. Now, 4 and 2 are just numbers that work for me. 3 and 3 may work better, 3 and 1, and so on. But the idea there is that the silence allows students to have a go on their own, spot things themselves, make some progress and so on, potentially get stuck, but then have something to talk about, something to collaborate with in those 2 minutes. And if students know that collaboration is limited to 2 minutes, in my experience, they get a lot more out of it. They take it a lot more seriously because they know their time's limited. And then back to 4 minutes, how much further can you get? Then 2 minutes, where do we get to, and so on. So that can work just on a practical level for getting the best of both worlds, allowing students a bit of independent time to work through things, but then to get all the benefits of collaboration and working together that we know that they get. But above and beyond that, it's a cultural issue in terms of we need students to realize that simply getting the question right isn't enough, isn't the end of the story. And for some students, just explaining that's enough. For other students, have done this before. It's digging out an examiner's report. It's digging out a SATs report. It's digging out a GCSE report and saying, look at all the marks here that students lose. And you can just pick any paper and the guarantees will be the case. Look at the marks students lose because they can't explain, they can't discuss, they can't describe. Perhaps that's the way, but it's getting students on board with why we're asking them to notice relationships, why we're asking them to spot things. But the final thing I'll say on that is, Often you don't have to do as much work on that as you'd think because of the power of surprise. It only takes students to be surprised once. So you imagine you've got a child who is absolutely convinced that the answer to question 5 is whatever, and they yell it out, then all of a sudden they find that it's not that. That surprise is really powerful. And I'm not talking in a kind of demoralizing way. I'm talking in a, whoa, what's going on? Okay, right, I better start thinking about this a bit harder kind of way. So choosing a sequence where there's some surprise in there, some counterintuitive results, some things that perhaps students aren't going to expect, that can really then make them realize that actually, before I start blurting things out, I maybe just need to be a bit more considered about this and think about this. So I think that can work quite well.
Lovely, thanks, Craig. Lynn's added some extra notes, which I think
great.
Thumbs up from Jim as well. So that's really good news. You've answered his question. So Lynn's extra notes, I think I've now understood. So I think her question is about scaffolding the things that the children might notice.
All right, okay, yes.
So might we, you know, when we're saying sort of, for example, where you had your different sections, where we're asking them to say, what do they expect? Or at the point of we say, what do you expect? Might we give them multiple choice in some of those boxes? Is that something that you try to kind of scaffold that?
That's interesting. It's not anything I've ever considered before, but again, most of the best ideas I've never thought of. So that sounds really good. This is always the interesting thing for me. Like, what do these ideas look like in different contexts, in different classrooms, particularly different age groups and so on? If that is a technique that will help support students in thinking this way, then I'm all for that. It's not something that I've ever played around with. Whenever I've witnessed this with younger students, as I say, year 2 is the youngest I've ever seen this, but particularly when I see this with year 3 and year 4, the writing's a lot less and it's much more about think on your own than tell the person next to you. But again, if we need a bit more support than that, then multiple choice could be an excellent way of doing it. It's just something I've never thought about, but I'm excited about that. That sounds fantastic.
So thinking about that fractions example, things like the numerator changes, the denominator changes, those sorts of options.
That's good.
Yeah, okay.
I like that. I'll be nicking that one. That's good. Yeah. Let's pretend I thought of that. That's
Please
brilliant.
credit Gateway Alliance. We don't have any other questions unless anybody who is still here has any other questions for Craig. There's nothing else in the chat.
Fantastic.
No, it doesn't look like anybody's wanting to ask another question. So thank you.
Thank you.
Colleagues, thanks for staying along. Thanks ever so much, Craig. That was absolutely
my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. No, it's always nice working with you guys. I enjoyed it a lot.
Definitely. Lovely. We'll see you again. I'll be in touch by email, Craig, anyway.
Perfect.
Cheers.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Craig.
Bye.
Bye.